No need for Gideon to show us the future because we're already here. When The Flash premiered in 2014, it pretty instantly shot up to become my favorite TV show on the air. Now, it goes without saying that the show kinda fell off the rails in the later seasons, but I'm not going to talk about that. I want to exclusively focus on the first season of The Flash, as I truly think it's one of the most cohesive and satisfyingly interconnected starts to a show that I've ever witnessed. Maybe only up there with Once Upon a Time. But of course, I loved the first season of Arrow, and that's what got me into watching The Flash in the first place, and Season 2 introduced us to that side of the DC universe, but The Flash somehow took a realistic down-to-earth world and successfully injected not only crazy superpowered metahumans, time travel, and the Speed Force, but also a humor and a hope that its predecessor couldn't even approach until much later in its run. From the very first moments of the pilot, the tone is set wonderfully with the pensive voiceover and the angelic music, leading to a touching scene with Barry and his parents, immediately followed by the tragedy of his mother's death. And despite having seen Barry struck by lightning almost a year earlier, it was a smart decision to backtrack a little bit and show us his life beforehand to establish all of the characters and their dynamics, and even things like Harrison Wells walking, which makes the wheelchair reveal all the more impactful. Of course, that is again flipped on its head in the tag of the episode at the end when he stands up, letting you know that something is up with this guy, and then he views the future article, which is why we're looking back on this today. And as a villainous choice for the first season, there was no better option than the Reverse Flash. He's the ultimate Flash foe with a deep-seated hatred for Barry, and is given the perfect reason for Barry to hate him in return, taking both of his parents in one fell swoop. But then that's turned on its head by having Eobard Thawne needing to care for Barry, watching over him and turn him into the hero that he so hated just for him to be able to leave this time period, easily securing the best dynamic between the hero and the villain in the entire show. But that also extends to the other characters who all had personal relationships with the central threat as well, something that really gets lost in the much later seasons. And honestly, the characters all around are pretty solid, especially for a first season. Usually people are a mere shadow of who they'll become later, but they especially nailed the Star Labs team from the start. Cisco is firing on all cylinders, being brilliant and funny, but also clearly just a genuine person with a good heart, without all of the baggage of not wanting his powers or his brother dying or what have you. Caitlin actually has a story here and her own motivations with Ronnie and trying to figure out what's happened to him, Iris actually becoming a reporter relevant to the plot and isn't insufferable just yet, Joe knocks it out of the park in any scene he's in with his sage wisdom, and if we're talking about advice sessions, we cannot overlook Barry's visits to Henry in prison. We lost these moments pretty early on in the show's run, so you might not even realize that it's missing, but you do feel the absence of such heartfelt scenes later on, even if you can't quite put your finger on it. I know the wonderful John Wesley Shipp also plays Jay Garrick later and does it well, but it's not the same relationship that he had as Barry's father. And of course, we can't talk about acting without mentioning the titular character. Grant Gustin can so beautifully pull off the genuine emotion called for in heavy scenes of sorrow, or candid displays of anger or fear, or simply the unbridled joy of being a superhero and discovering his powers for the first time. And then of course the reverse, with Tom Cavanaugh effortlessly playing both sides, never fails to entertain. I think the rest of the show does a decent job of showcasing the man's talents, but he is a truly terrifying villain in the first season of this show, and I don't think that it would have been as popular without him in that role. But I do think it's worth going through some of the highlights to see just what made the show connect with people so much, because the pilot did break records on the CW for being one of their most watched programs, so they must have done something right. Weather Wizard, or at least his brother, was a decent choice for the first foe, and the tornado set piece at the end was quite visually impressive and holds up much better than some other visual effects in later seasons. Also, just in case you forgot, this show was a spinoff of Arrow. They bring in Oliver Queen to talk to Barry about his newfound powers and deliver that iconic line about the lightning choosing Barry, and even giving him the hero name while telling him to wear a mask. You can really tell the camaraderie here, and to return the favor, they included Barry in the season 3 premiere of Arrow at the same time. Maybe that was another reason why I loved watching The Flash so much, because in the early days it was pretty heavily tied to Arrow, with Felicity almost being a full-blown supporting character, like in episode 4 when she just comes to Central City, and then she returns only at the end of episode 4 of Arrow's third season, showing you that these series are occurring in real time. But we'll come back to the Emerald Archer later. We should talk about this episode bringing in Captain Cold as well. For a show all about metahumans, a regular dude with a freeze ray shouldn't be that interesting, but they do a good job establishing why they brought him back so often. But to me, one of the more seminal episodes of the first season is episode 6, The Flash is Born. It may seem odd to have a name like that a month and a half into your show, but this truly does set a lot of things in place for the status quo of this universe, such as Iris's relationship with the Flash as a reporter, and not the least of which his actual name being used by the masses. This episode is even bookended by the exact lines from the pilot, read by Iris this time. Sure, the high school bully angle may be a bit cliched, but it works well enough for a group of nerds like the Star Labs gang, and even though Barry did run on water just last episode, the supersonic punch is so satisfying to watch him pull off. Not to mention the terrific B-plot of Joe investigating Dr. Wells to see if he had anything to do with Nora's murder, only to be threatened in the tag by the Reverse Flash himself. Then episode 8 starts the much-loved tradition of the annual crossover, this time being Flash vs. Arrow. Seeing the main 3 members of each team going onto the other show in the same week? That must have been a pretty busy schedule, but they made it work, and they even come up with a believable reason for Barry and Oliver to fight, and show off their unique skills quite well. And this crossover also establishes their mentoring relationship in their training sequences, and even some running gags like Oliver having shot Barry in the back, or Diggle's unease anytime that Barry uses his speed.
I had a cousin got hit by lightning once. He just developed a stutter.
And arguably this era was the peak of the crossovers, since they were far more casual and frequent than when they had 5 or 6 shows running all at the same time. But the crossover isn't just for ratings' sake, because they further both of the season arcs by Barry displaying new powers, and Eddie discovering the Flash is real and starting a task force to catch him, while Oliver indicates that Harrison Wells isn't what he seems, while also meeting the mother of his son. That wasn't even mentioned on the previously on segment. They didn't hold your hand, you just had to know that information going into the episode. And as I already mentioned about the post-credit tags, they always add some suspense to keep you coming back next time, contributing to what is probably my favorite kind of storytelling, that being largely episodic, but interwoven with threads of the overarching season-long narrative, creating a sort of mild serialization. And of course, episode 8 ends with a bang by showing us the Burning Man, aka Ronnie, in the present for the first time. This leads to the fantastic episode 9, The Man in the Yellow Suit, where Barry discovers the man who murdered his mother is still out there, with some excellent dramatic tension that's actually earned from what we've seen thus far. And of course, Caitlin's search for Ronnie also contrasting the cheery Christmas setting, but he does come in at the end to help, implying that he could one day be a fellow hero. And I haven't really talked about Eddie too much, but he was pretty great in the last 2 episodes, and his confrontation with the Reverse Flash is nail-bitingly stressful to watch, but it keeps the question in the back of your mind, why didn't Reverse Flash just kill him? So then it can be a bit frustrating to kick the can down the road the next couple of episodes, like with the Rogues coming in again with their weird characterizations.
What are you talking about?
And then you have the Pied Piper, and then you have Peekaboo, arguably not moving the story along enough and being a bit boring, although I would say the only outright unenjoyable episode is number 7, Power Outage. But even in these somewhat lesser episodes, they do weave in character beats that are important for their development. But even if they were spinning their wheels a bit, I can only assume it was because they were pouring all of their efforts into episode 13, The Nuclear Man. I think it's important context to remember that reportedly The Flash was only ordered for 13 episodes, which would have made this the make or break point for whether or not they furthered the series, and they clearly gave it their all, bringing back Firestorm to finally get them sorted out, culminating in The Flash running away from a nuclear explosion, which is an amazing cliffhanger and demands a conclusion with another episode. However, this was also the episode where Cisco and Joe went back to the Allen house and tested the blood to learn that an adult Barry was there, meaning that the Flash was in a fight to save his mom, confirming the existence of time travel. No wonder the show got picked up for 10 more episodes after this. And of course, the second half of the story, Fallout, works from bringing in Firestorm as a hero equal to the Flash, and of course teasing Grodd at the end, but then pretty much every episode from here on is a home run, all leading to the season-long arc. And the next one, number 15, Out of Time, is up there for the crown jewel as one of the best episodes in the entire 9-year run. I'm not even joking, it starts as a normal day other than the reintroduction of Weather Wizard's brother, and a strange sense of deja vu, I suppose, but then this random episode in the middle of the season starts to play out like a finale. Joe has been skeptical of Wells for a long time, and since Cisco helped him with the time-traveling blood, he now needs Caitlin to distract Wells, but he figures it out, revealing himself to Caitlin, and then he runs back to Star Labs to tell Cisco that he is the bad guy and that he's related to Eddie, only to chillingly murder a beloved main character while Weather Wizard is destroying the city, and Barry and Iris then kiss, and he reveals himself as the Flash. This is seriously all the things that you would put in a major cliffhanger, but then the show hits the reset button by Barry accidentally time traveling, and it doesn't even feel cheap like it can in later seasons.
What do you see?
A dead body.
Barry, you're in a morgue. You're gonna have to be a little more specific than that.
Maybe not a satisfying follow-up to the phenomenal previous episode, but Rogue Time still addresses the consequences of traveling through time even just one day without the proper planning. And you might also say that the next episode, Tricksters, is a bit too much of a departure, but that is so far from the truth. I mean, have you seen the opening set piece? And the entire B-plot where Eobard Thawne steals Harrison Wells' identity and kills him? That is must-watch viewing right there. But they not only somehow got Mark Hamill back to play the Trickster, but also used the events of the original Flash TV show as canon for why he was in prison in the first place. And of course, he steals the show, having brilliant one-liners, making allusions to Star Wars as well, interacting with John Wesley's ship after all these years, and of course using the speed bomb prank that makes Barry learn how to phase for the first time. Episode 17 also had Barry reveal his identity not only to his father, but also to Eddie as well, fully bringing him into the fold as they push into full drive for their investigation of Dr. Wells, since his phasing speech has fully convinced Barry that he is somehow the Reverse Flash.
Ooh, it's active! Run, 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 run!
Then episode 18 is All-Star Team-Up, a clever nod to the comics, with Ray and Felicity coming over to try out his Atom suit. Kind of confusing actually if you're watching the equivalent Arrow episodes, it's a bit out of order, but here Ray and Felicity are pretty great. It's fun to watch her and Barry trade woes as true friends, Ray and Cisco working together on the suit and fostering a bond over their shared love of naming things, and including Dr. Tina McGee from the old Flash TV show too. And sure, the crazy bee lady may be a bit goofy for a villain, but this is a show with time travel and later a multiverse, so we can buy some robot bees.
Ain't nobody got time for bees.
This extended crossover even goes into the next week with Joe and Cisco going to Starling City to figure out what happened to Wells all those years ago, and Cisco creates the Canary Cry device that Laurel uses in the very next episode of Arrow, so that's cool. But then over the course of the next 2 episodes, Caitlin and Cisco are brought into the Wells investigation. This leads them to discover the Time Vault, and Gideon confirming their suspicions while showing them the newspaper of today, and then they create some special goggles for Cisco to control his dreaming, but in retrospect, it's not dreaming, he's actually vibing. Like seriously, the structure is exactly the same as his vibes in later seasons, with the exact same blue filter and sound effects and everything. So we shouldn't have really been surprised when he got those powers. And of course the trap they set for Reverse Flash fails because he's always one step ahead, and then he kidnaps Eddie, leading Iris to discover that Barry is the Flash. Quite the shift in character dynamics, which I think is part of what makes the first season so satisfying, because they take the time to build character relations into the norm, but then also take the time to reflect on what those changes are and explore how Barry is mad at Joe for suspecting Wells, but then comes to believe him, and then how Team Flash is also hurt that Barry would even doubt Wells, and how Iris feels about the Flash as a hero, but then also exploring her frustrations that her best friend was keeping this giant secret from her, and then of course the complex feelings that Wells has about watching Barry grow up in almost a parental fashion, but also being fueled with so much hatred and contempt for his arch nemesis. And of course that everyone actually has a relationship to Wells that makes it far more interesting than in later seasons, when they really only focus on everyone's romantic pairings instead of all of their dynamics in such an effective but continuous manner. Not just one episode of lip service to a relationship here or there when they tell and don't show. The worst you could say is that it took Eddie too long to be fully integrated into Star Labs, but that's not even that big of a complaint. But then of course we ought to discuss the episode with Grodd, because it would have been so easy for this to have been far too ridiculous, even compared to everything else that we've seen up to this point. But not only does the story work, the effects still hold up surprisingly well, even better than some of the later seasons of this show, but Grodd is rendered with such care that you actually believe he's in the scene, having leapt straight out of the pages of a comic book. Then there is the whole thing about Captain Cold transporting metas on a plane or whatever, but the important part of that episode is in the last few minutes when Reverse Flash shows up, and as we know, Barry is no match for him, but that's no problem, because we not only have Firestorm coming back to the rescue, but also Oliver Queen to help. Don't worry that it doesn't really make sense with what was currently happening on Arrow that week. We not only got the genesis of one of the greatest recurring lines in the whole show,
Nanites, courtesy of Ray Palmer,
but also directly set up the Flash showing up in Arrow's Season 3 finale as well, perfectly bookending the whole year for both of these series. This of course leaves Wells captured for the finale fast enough, where we finally get some answers as to what his evil plan is to get home, and he offers Barry the choice to travel back in time to save his mom. So Barry talks to his dad one last time, and of course other characters have their moments too, like Caitlin marrying Ronnie, Cisco confronting Wells about killing him, and then it's revealed that he is a meta, and even Eddie gets a pretty great pep talk from Stein about his place in the world, and then eventually Barry decides to take up the offer. Barry runs past events that we haven't even seen yet, and then he finds himself on the night his mother died. This of course leads to an emotional gut punch when poised to leap into action. His future self tells him not to go through with it. Advice that Barry follows, leading to a heart-wrenching scene where he comforts his mother in her final moments and lets her know that he's okay. As far out as this show could get in later seasons, it's always impressive the genuine emotion that they could squeeze out in the early years. Barry then returns to the present to stop Reverse Flash from going home, which sort of backfires as he goes on a rampage. However, the day is not saved by the Flash, but by Eddie killing himself so that Eobard will never be born. My jaw hit the floor when I saw this. I was utterly shocked when it first happened, but it makes perfect sense, and it feels earned because it was there all along, and really there was no other way of beating him, he was just that strong. But of course that paradox rips open a singularity to wipe the timeline from existence, but Barry has to try to stop it, with a bunch of other characters looking on, including a Hawk Girl that we haven't even met yet, and the show just ends right there. It's not about whether Barry is successful in saving everyone, the point is that he's going to try. So in conclusion, there's a reason that at the time when asked, I would say The Flash was my favorite TV show, because it was a consistently rewarding experience week to week, especially if you were paying attention to the details of the overarching narrative sprinkled throughout. And no matter your stance on the style of Arrow, you have to admit that it felt almost ashamed of being a comic book in the early seasons, while The Flash instantly embraced the color, humor, and camp that comes from living in a superhero world. Pick any character and an argument could easily be made that this is their peak right here, and not just because a lot of them die later on. It's too common for characters to become caricatures, or in the show's initial stages to be too ill-defined to be interesting, but they strike such a refreshing balance in their inaugural season that's hard to find in any show, let alone right off the bat. I can only imagine that having worked on Arrow for a few years helped them to know what was important in establishing a new wing of this universe, because even if some of the characters are following the same general stereotypes of their sister show, they do it differently enough to all maintain their identity when they cross over. So for me, the overall standouts are definitely Grant Gustin's exquisite acting, being able to really make you believe what's happening on screen, and likewise Jesse Martin as Joe always delivers, and Tom Cavanaugh is so good as a simultaneous mentor and nemesis. And while the different Wells are always entertaining in later years, it almost makes you wonder why the Reverse Flash got so hammy by the end when you know the great work that he can do in this role. Even the Villain of the Week format is not fully isolated because some of the characters do come back more than once, and the major mysteries being strung along at a decent pace to keep you enticed with every episode. Of course, making masterful use of the tag post-title card. It really did take something away from the show when they stopped doing these little teases in Season 2 onwards, and it's pretty clear that they realized this when they eventually brought them back for good. So as wild and bombastic as the series might have gotten in the future, I feel that looking back to remember how enjoyably effective the show was on this day, the day that Flash vanished in Crisis, like the show itself, makes everything come full circle. Even if Crisis technically actually happened on a different day, but who cares?